leave your phone at home when you go out and just do it a couple of times. Like, you go out to lunch with friends, leave it at home. I think leaning into boring things is where all of the gold is, because people don't tend to want to do it and they have a hard time in those spaces. If you have high ego and you can't look at your own flaws or faults and, can't acknowledge where you're wrong, the most confident people can ingest and say, you can always tell a very confident versus arrogant person, because a confident person can hear challenges and correct. No one gets to a point of being ultra successful by following common paths. And common paths are what the majority of people follow.
Before we dive into this episode, I want to ask you to hit the subscribe button here on YouTube. It helps keep growing the channel and keep getting fantastic guests like this one. Dr. Julie, we're back together. Fantastic. Welcome to the show.
It is wonderful to be back. Lovely to see you.
And I was thinking about all the different things that we could cover today after our last episode was so well received by my listeners. They took away so many points. And the first thing that came to my mind was something that you've been writing about and speaking about, and I think many people that listen to a podcast like this one will relate to, and that's having unreasonably high standards. Now, initially, somebody might bristle and think, unreasonably high? That sounds like a negative thing. But you're out there banging the drum, Julie, for us to have unreasonably high standards. Why is that?
I'm definitely banging that drum. I think that having low standards or mediocre standards is how we end up very unhappy and not really getting the things that we want out of life. Setting a unreasonably high standard keeps you out of situations where people end up putting up with things that are really below par. When you don't have a very high standard, you end up settling for jobs that mistreat you or you don't like. You end up stuck in relationships that are not quite to the standard that you'd like, or maybe you don't get the most out of. But people don't feel comfortable advocating for that standard. If you hold a high standard, you have a bar. And that bar, it kind of inspires you to reach for the things that you truly want. If you have a standard where you say, look, at one, I'm going to have an unreasonably high standard. I am going to expect that I'm going to make six figures 2 years after leaving college. And maybe for some people that does seem like an unreasonably high standard. But that's then a new mark in the sky that you're going to shoot for. If you have an unreasonably high standard that my business is going to make $5 million 2 years after it starts, or maybe the second year, the second or third year after it starts, you will shoot for those things. And I think that for me, holding a high bar really helps you drive to something that is beyond the mediocre, that ends up holding a lot of people in lives that they don't really want to have. And they feel ultimately very dissatisfied with. But that starts with, life doesn't happen to you. You have some control over how you filter out the experiences of your life. And having those standards gives you a filter. And I think that's the most important aspect of them, honestly.
Sometimes I think when we lower our standards and expectations, and this is more an American term than a UK term, but it's a little bit of a cope. And we can say, I beat my target last year, but you knew that your target was very attainable. You knew that it was something that was possible. And in my sales career, the big two phrases that I've always spoken about is budget, which is the absolute minimum that I must do, and then target. So of course, if I hit budget, it's all good. We're not gonna have sackings. We're not gonna have redundancies. We're not gonna have big problems. We're not gonna have issues. But when I hit my target, that's when the commission and the bonuses get to a level that is stretching and it's more exciting and it's more rewarding. So having those kind of two between phases of what I need to achieve is actually quite helpful. Of course, if I was to lower my target to something that was completely achievable, there wouldn't be the same sense of urgency to work towards it. There wouldn't be the same stretching feeling. And I think there's important to not have like something that's so easily attainable, as you say, because then we don't come with the same energy that we really, really want to have.
Well, what I love about that concept is I think most people are working to budget, right? I mean, they're working just for the basics, to cover the basics. And you'll hear it even in how people speak about their job. Well, it pays the bills. People will say that. And that's working to budget. So, what is your target? And I think that's a really great framework to showing the gap between like the baseline acceptable that most people will put up with. But if you ask that person about their job and they say, well, it pays the bills, is that a job you're excited about? Is that a job that's really giving you everything that you want? It's not that you can't have it, but it's that this is what you're settling for. And settling is always at a low range of expectation. So you want people to really feel as though they can have the initiative and actually believe in themselves enough to say, hey, I'm going to set a target that is going to seem unreasonable to other people. It doesn't mean that it's unreasonable to you. And a saying that I really like is that, it's easier than you think to beat the odds, because the odds are based on average people. If you do the things that average people don't do, if you set targets for things that average people don't, you're going to take chances and risks and opportunities that other people just won't. And it puts you a step ahead. It makes you proud of yourself, and it reinforces something fantastic, that, allows you to take the next step and beyond.
I think so many people that listen to podcasts like this one, you are, by your very decision to tune into content like this, voting to not be average, because the average person is consuming trash television or binge watching series that they've probably seen before, or they're doom scrolling TikTok. You're
Yeah,
giving yourself that opportunity. And it's just a case of like, how can I apply that in many other areas of my life? And it not just be a case of listening to the content, but maybe applying it as well. And one of the things that I find important when I think about this unreasonably high standard piece is being selective about where I have unreasonably high standards. And that's not to say to not have unreasonably high standards across
sure.
many areas in life, but if you have it in all areas of life, I understand that that's maybe a bit of a jump for somebody to go from maybe being satisfied with standard or reasonable or okay for a long period across so many areas. But I wonder, Julie, where would you maybe advocate somebody maybe turns their attention to make unreasonably high standards in a particular area to start?
I think you have to think about what your priorities are, because you're absolutely right. And there's a saying that, how you do one thing is how you do everything. And I couldn't disagree more, right? I think that, you will find that some people are incredibly high achievers, and then, they struggle to like remember to pay their general bills in their home, right? I mean, it's a very strange thing. But you have to think about, what are my top priorities? Are my top priorities making a certain amount of money? Are my top priorities making sure my health and fitness is solid and on point? I think you can choose a few and really put exceptional effort and high standards into those things. And maybe it's your business, your health, and your family, right? And if you can hit those at a very high caliber, and everything else gets to be, maybe as good as you can do it, then I think you probably can have a pretty exceptional life.
I think so. And there's a phrase that links in nicely to that I learned from Oliver Burkeman, who was on the show recently. He wrote a book called 4,000 Weeks, which is quite a stark reminder that's the average life expectancy that we have.
Mm,
And he was speaking about choosing what you're going to suck at. And I think
mm,
that's so helpful. So, for example, if you chose those three pillars, business, family, and health, fantastic pillars. But it might mean that you're not going to be great at golf, or you're not going to watch your football team in person as much as you wanted to, or
right.
perhaps you're not going to go out and party and be as social as you thought you might. And having that in the back of your mind to know that I'm going to try and be narrow and deep and excel in these areas, and these other areas, they're probably not going to be where I show up as often as I thought I would. I'm probably not going to be up to date on the scores for the league for this season and know who's doing well and what players are doing great. And I don't have a fantasy football team registered. You need to almost accept that that's the case so that you can go narrower and deeper in those other areas. And equally, one of the most interesting parts of our conversation last time around, I got a lot of messages around, was you and I had a little bit of back and forth on people building in public nowadays and actually
Mm,
nailing business and body, which previously was not the case because there wasn't the same social media
sure,
pressure. So I really like that you and I had that discussion. But also, when you've named those three pillars, sometimes the skills within one area like business and health can be really complementary if we nail those both at
sure.
once. And I certainly think that's been the case for me. I know that in the sales world, and when it comes to being articulate and well spoken on the podcast, if I'm nailed on my health and my nutrition, I'm turning up to this call with Dr. Julie ready to go.
I would even extend it beyond that. If you nail your relationship, you're not having the negative pull even in your everyday business life. There is nothing more distracting and agitating than having challenges going on at home or challenges going on in your relationships. And then you're supposed to be focused and dialed in at work. So, I mean, like, so they all work together, and it's a choice, right? But I think that as you kind of mentioned, a choose for these things is a choice against other things. And you have to be okay just saying, the choices that I make are going to be specific to me. It will reflect my priorities. And it means that I'm just going to have hard lines in other areas of my life. And people who want to be a part of that can be. And the ones who cannot, that's okay. You have to evolve and continue to move.
There's a real funny nature when it comes to me preparing for these podcasts, because when I start to think about these concepts, I see them everywhere. And
Hmm.
I'm preparing for giving a training next week to a bunch of young sales guys who've just kind of started out in their careers. And part of it, to kind of humanize it, I'm 10 years deep, despite the baby face. I've been working in sales for 10 years, and I'm reflecting on some of the parts of my journey. And when I'm thinking about having unreasonably high standards, I remember in my early days having people that I kind of bristled up against within the corporate world who didn't like the standards that I held myself to, and I
Yeah,
maybe held them to when they were working on projects with me or trying to enforce things. And I find it can be challenging to be the person, especially when you're younger and you're maybe more junior, to be the one that's maybe pushing the boat within an organization. And I just wonder what your advice might be for somebody that's holding themselves to a really high standard, and maybe some people around them, especially people who maybe have seniority on you, can pull
sure,
rank. They're maybe
sure.
not pulling in the same direction or operating at the same standard. Julie, how would you handle that?
I think that you look at that as an example of what you don't want to become and recognize that your career isn't going to top at this level, right? I mean, I think that everybody who is ambitious goes through this. So it's a wonderful thing that you bring up where you look around and you say, I don't want to end up like that. You have those moments, whether you're in jobs or, you're socializing with other people and you hear their perspective and you keep quiet. And in your head, you think, oh God, I don't want to end up like that. That's not who I want to become. And I can even remember sitting in graduate school and, I'm sitting with a bunch of peers and they say, I want to go around and, kind of, we talk about expectations. They say, well, how much do you really think you're going to make being a psychologist and, kind of going through and getting a doctorate in psychology? And people went around the room and they all said certain numbers. And mine was about 5 times more than everyone else's. And they were like, the teacher, the professor literally kind of ridiculed it and said, well, where do you think you're going to make that kind of money? And, it took a while, right? And it took some effort and I didn't always know where I would end up. But, today I tried to look up to see, because I probably make 10 times what that professor makes today, at least. And so it's a really interesting full circle. And I think for those who are in that position today, to recognize your journey is not yet done. And the fact that you are different and you have these differences is actually good signal for you. Because if you didn't have those differences, then where you end up is where that person with the limited belief is sitting right now. You don't want to end up there. So I do think that it almost can be a counter signal of, like it's not a signal that you fit in there, and that's a good thing.
It's a reverse role model.
Yeah.
And I think it's really helpful sometimes to have some, like, it's great to have figures that we look up to, but it's also great to be like, there's no way I want to operate like that. There's no way I want to hold myself like that.
Yeah.
And I saw that all the time as well. I saw it with guys that were maybe afraid to make the call, or they would
Yeah.
flake with the customer, or they would just discount as soon as something challenging came up. They were like, oh, we'll drop the price. And I'm thinking, I don't think that's the right commercial decision. Like, why don't you have a difficult conversation? And
Hmm.
seeing what you don't want to be like can be as helpful to maybe find somebody in the workplace to grab onto their coattails and say, like, take me with you. That's amazing. But having
Hmm.
that other figure where you're like, oh, I see how they operate, and that's not my bag, and that's not how I want to conduct myself. We've got to use everything that's available to us.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
And that leads me to one of the articles that I picked out for us to chat about today, Dr. Julie, and that was use it all. And for me, when you're writing about that, there's all these different emotions and feelings that people have. But what are some of the ones that you think people should tap into more?
I'm a really big fan of the emotions that most people avoid, which are the negative ones, strongly negative ones, right? So we look at anger and rage and all of these things that people carry with them. And most people will, I guess you get warnings around them, right? Like be careful, these things will destroy you. You're encouraged to suppress them. But in psychology, one of the things that we know is energy, right? And there is no more powerful energy than anger or rage or humiliation, all of those things that we pull in from experiences that we are hesitant to even touch, that we want to forget about. I think that, improperly channeled, those things are destructive, right? They can lead to addictions and people can go down terrible paths. But properly channeled, those are some of the strongest fuel you will ever have. And so I'm an incredibly big fan of not taking away your own power by pushing those things to the side and really channeling those in, locking yourself in, and using those things to like force your future with everything you've got. And I think that people miss out when they put those things to the side. And there's a lot of talk around the power of stoicism, and I think it has its place. But using the energy that that you contain, and funneling it in the correct way, there's really nothing that can touch it, and it's an endless source of fuel. So these people who kind of burn out, and they not just around burnout, because burnout's a real thing, but the people who will flame out, I guess I should say, where they give it a hard run and then they stop, or they start something, they don't finish it. When you really tap into some of these negative emotions, you start to push yourself in ways that you never would have imagined. So that's my brief kind of thought on that, I guess.
Well, if I think about that professor that almost laughed at your aspirations for your
Mhm.
financial goals, I can bet you've thought about that moment when it's been hard in your career, or when you've been wanting to study for the exam, or when you've been trying to win that new client. You've been like, the whole like, I'll show you. And of course, if that's your only driving factor, I think that's a big problem for somebody. But spite, for example, around maybe a slight or a put down that you had, or somebody mocking like what your aspirations are, I think that should be something that we think about a lot. And you hear many entrepreneurs like, oh, I wrote down that what that person said,
Yeah.
or I turned back up at the job that I used to have and I stuck my finger up and said, like, look at my car now. Like, there's different
Mhm.
levels to the game, isn't there? But I really
Yeah.
think that if you can use that as a fuel source, let's add it to the fire.
I agree with you. And you see it at people at all levels. I remember watching an early interview with Jeff Bezos, and he was early days at Amazon. And they said, "Well, what's next for you?" And he talked about, as a boy, I would love to go to space. And you could literally hear the audience laughing. And I thought, how interesting that now, years later, we see Blue Origin has come into existence. He takes this journey with his brother and others, and he's talking about, oh, we should develop infrastructure, and we should do all this stuff. No one is laughing. He's incredibly excited, like a young kid hopping off and from that journey. And it just goes to show you that people can tuck away these things, but it's your resilience and your self knowledge that's going to get you where you need to be. It's really not about referencing other people, because if you do that, you're going to stay within their boundaries. And thank God that many of us don't choose to go that path.
Of course, because we would then just act in alignment with their expectations, and their expectations are far below what we're potentially capable of. And again, if you are somebody that wants to live to your potential, you're going to have to disregard an awful lot of societal expectations and societal pressures that are on around you.
It's true. And, I really think about that as having like, what is your reference point? Is it internal? Is it yourself? I know what I can do. I know what I'm capable of. I know, kind of what my next moves are. Or is it external? Like what your friend says you can do, what your parents think you can do, what your boss thinks you can do, and the feedback you're getting from those people. And while it's important to listen to some things, periodically around, certain character traits or maybe other things, allowing other people to define your potential will create a very small life. And so you want to be sure that you are the person who is deciding, where you take your next moves, where your next steps are, what your capacity is. And it's fascinating to me, because most people I speak with, even if they're at high levels of achievement, will tell you, I still feel like I have more in the tank. I still feel that there's more that I can do. And I think that's an inherent kind of internal feeling that people want to satisfy. And if you aren't doing it at a certain level, I think we disappoint ourselves, and that's the worst type of disappointment, is walking around watching other people win and succeed, watching them kind of surpass you, and knowing. I mean, the hard thing is, when you kind of know some of those folks, is you say, that person is doing so well, and they're not as smart as I am. They're not as creative or talented as I am. But what they have is execution. They have risk tolerance. They have a bit of moxie, and they go for it. And it counts for a lot to show up and to try.
I really believe that. And sometimes we can discredit others when we look at them, and we maybe say things like they're not as smart or not as creative as us.
Mhm.
But they have, as you said, they've optimized for action to some extent, and they've maybe
Yeah.
taken higher risks and they've been rewarded for it. And I think that's something that I definitely admire in other people, because there's some areas of life where I see myself having a really high level of mastery, and people will ask me like, how have you done this or how have you done that? And then there's other areas I look at other people and I think, wow, if I really turn my hand to it the way they have, I think I could do the same, but I haven't.
Mhm.
So I cannot have envy or discredit the fruits of their labor if I haven't kind of been the man in the arena, so to speak, in their space either.
I think that's a wonderful perspective. I think a lot of times what we tend to do when people are ready to stop their journey, a lot of times what they end up doing is downward comparison. They'll be like, well, at least I'm not X, or, at least I'm not Y. But downward comparison is kind of that death knell of mediocrity. You'll kind of stay where you're at because you're always going to be better than somebody else, better off than someone else. But comparing upward, and upward comparison, I think can be really inspiring and motivational. It doesn't have to be envious or kind of filled with jealousy. And how you're thinking about it, I think, is absolutely right. Whereas, yeah, everyone has character traits that aren't going to be spectacular, but what are the things they're doing right? And how can I use that as motivation to start tapping into that myself? I can't really criticize somebody who's done massive things. It's always interesting to hear people who are, whether they're criticizing Elon Musk or they're criticizing the Kardashians. I mean, very controversial figures out there, all of them executing at an incredibly high level, doing things that are clearly paying off and moving the needle in their particular areas. And I find it inspirational across the board.
Yeah, and we should tap into that. One of the emotions that I was thinking about before we hit record and about using it is the emotion of boredom. And it's a really rare emotion to have nowadays, given that we're plugged in 24/7. We have so many
Yeah.
options available at our fingertips to explore. What are some of the benefits if we were to lean into our boredom more?
I think leaning into boring things is where all of the gold is because people don't tend to want to do it and they have a hard time in those spaces. And so you look at, where is everyone else? And that's a very crowded door. And then you look at the things that people are unwilling to do. And those are the things that usually produce, exponential outcomes. So, we see everything in the world is very flashy, like what you wear, what your car is, where you're going. Instagram is kind of built around that, as are other things. But the things that build those lifestyles are absolutely boring and grinding and and I think that's the thing that we don't show because it's nobody wants to see it. No one would press like on the fact that, like, hey, here's me day 70 sitting at my computer, doing my Word doc. I don't think anybody cares about that. You could post that every single day and be an absolute monster of a builder, and no one's going to really give you a lot of, kind of credit for that. But that is absolutely what they could be posting or should be posting if you kind of end up seeing these outcomes. So we end up celebrating the outcomes, minimizing what contributes to them, and not sitting in the boring spaces ourselves. Nobody likes to sit in them. All of the work that is, you have to have fortitude for it because it creates, you have to sit in these spaces where you're doing things you hate doing and everything you love. And all these sayings, I think give the wrong message. Like, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And I don't know about you, Colin, but I love my job. I love it, and I'm obsessed with it. But let me tell you, it comes with a lot of things I don't love to. I hate paperwork around taxes. I hate, like, there are so many things I don't love about it too that we have to get through. And so, I'm sure that you experience that also. But in order to have success, for example, in sales or success with a podcast, there are a lot of things that you have to be willing to do to get to the good stuff. And that's true for outcomes too, I would imagine.
So much so, and there's so much minutia that goes into executing at a high level that goes on behind the scenes that are like the micro details that, of course, no, you would never post or never show or never
Right.
talk about. And like the outbound messages that I send to guests like yourself when we've not been acquainted before, like I need to nail that in order to make that happen. And that's gotten so much better over the years that guests find it well received and they're impressed by the approach and they're happy to come on.
Mhm.
But that's years and years of crafting that message to a particular format that I'm going to use and do well with. In the same way, hitting particular revenue numbers in work, there's so much that goes on behind the scenes to make that project all come into fruition, rather than just the revenue number that I maybe share to my story to say that I've hit a new target or whatever else as well, and people are buzzing for. And there's a phrase that I wrote, and every year for my birthday I do like 30 lessons at 30 or 30 thoughts at 31 or with 31
Nice.
thoughts at 31 and stuff like that, and it's really good. It's really cathartic. And one of them maybe it was 2 years ago now, was win offline to win online. And so
Mm.
many people are so focused on let's get the gratification and the celebration on Instagram or on X or on whatever platform. But in order to show up on that platform and be balling out or celebrating or winning, there's so much, as you say, that's gone on behind the scenes to do that. So, for example,
Yeah.
if I post a physique photo on holiday when I've got the abs out and people are like, whoa,
Mhm.
you're looking jacked. And I'm like, yes, I've lifted weights for like 15 years and tracked calories in my steps for like 10 of them. Of course I'm going to look better than the average punter. Like it's just how it is. But by doing the work away, whether it's sales or podcasting or coaching, whatever field you're in, there's so much that's going away on behind the scenes that's potentially boring to somebody, and they're maybe just craving that moment of adulation online where it's exciting and celebratory, but there's loads of stuff on behind the scenes that you've had to tick off.
Absolutely, and I think that's where people are seeking the shortcuts, right? So, like, your physique is a great example because it's a lifestyle. It's not just, I just go to the gym for an hour. It is, I am more mindful about what I eat. I'm mindful what I supplement. I'm mindful about, like all sorts of different things that create a lifestyle around that. And that's why people are like, well, I'll just do the surgery. I'll just do the injection. I'll just do the whatever. And they're trying to get that result. And it's not something that you can really do. And it's the same is true with fame. The same is true for, like outcomes around consulting work. The same is true for all of these things. And I always say that, people ask about my education. And I always say, I think my education is a tremendous advantage because there aren't many people who want to study psychology for 8 to 10 years and then leverage it with business and do all of these other things. And so there are the things that we do that are boring that no one else wants to do end up being incredible advantages in our business and life. But you're right. No one posts about those things. Like you would be posting, here I am calculating my macros again today. Here I am, like making sure I tick off my right workout and I'm loading properly today. And no one cares. But, the body picture by the pool, everybody's going to, love it. So
That's
you
what
make a great
attracts the
point.
attention. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I really see that. The other point around being boring, I was thinking about being bored. And that was
Mm,
something that many of us can't sit with now because, and I'm as
yeah.
guilty as anyone. You reach for your phone, or I'll check
Yeah.
email again, or I'm going to stop doing this hard slide on my presentation or write this hard email to the client and just check my Instagram DM or just check my LinkedIn to see how that post getting on. And like trying desperately to escape that feeling of inertia about the next task. And it's normally a quote unquote boring task that we're in. And I really see, as you clearly outlined, Julie, that sitting in the boredom and doing the thing that you said you were going to do when you said you were going to do it is what accumulates over time so much more massively. So I'm really working hard on sitting in the discomfort sometimes of the task that I know needs done, and it's not exciting, it's not sexy, it's not that fun, and it's not immediately gratifying, but just trying my absolute best to not run away from it.
I think that's really important, and I understand completely about the phone. I would give everyone a challenge. It's going to seem super easy, but like leave your phone at home when you go out and just do it a couple of times. Like, you go out to lunch with friends, leave it at home. Like, you're going to be getting text. That's okay. You'll get text. You can explain it when you get there. You know that you're going to have messages. You're going to have emails, but like, can you take a couple hours and just be disconnected? Can you go for a walk and leave your phone at home? Can you go to the gym and leave your phone at home? Like, challenge yourself in certain moments because what you find is that it's very anxiety provoking at first. You'll want to check and you'll have messages on your watch, or hopefully you don't wear that sort of watch. You don't, so that's good. But there are all sorts of ways in which you can get notifications. But what you start doing is training yourself not to be trained by the technology that you're a part of. The technology is training you, and you should be the master over that. And so allowing yourself to be in control of your own dopamine and your own responsiveness and stop to be a reactive player and instead become more proactive in your life. And it does create a lot of challenge at first. And people give me all sorts of scenarios. What if you go out running, Julie, and you're attacked and something happens and now you don't have your phone? And I say, well, somehow people went running before the kind of cell phone. I'll put it in my car and I'll go where I need to go. And, hopefully if I'm attacked on the trail, someone will find me. And that's the risk I'm willing to take, to have my brain free and to not kind of think about it. So I think everybody has to make their own call, but I would challenge people, take your technology and start being a master over it rather than allowing it to just contact you at will.
Oh, it's so hard, but
Hard.
I think you're probably acquainted with Sahil Bloom on X. Probably he's a great
I
creator,
am.
and Sahil was on the show a couple of years ago now, actually before the last time we spoke, and he encouraged people to take a notepad out on their walk.
Mhm.
Don't take your phone. Now, of course, I'm a huge advocate of listening to a podcast or listening to an audiobook when you're out walking and
Mhm.
using that time. But sometimes walking without any stimulus whatsoever, you will find so much comes to front of mind when
Yeah.
you remove the external stimulus. So he takes out his notepad and he comes back and he's got like 3 newsletter ideas. He knows how he's going to deal with that client call that he's been worried about. And I've done it, I would say, less than 10 times. And every time I do it, I'm like, I need to do this more often. But my chimp brain takes my phone with me way too often. So it's about building the habit,
Yeah.
going out there with that notepad. And it's the same sometimes for, I speak sometimes about shower thoughts. So there's no
Mhm.
music on. I'm just in the shower. I can't have my phone in there. So my brain's like, oh, Colin, why have you not thought about this? And it's sometimes the same if somebody's lying in bed at night and they're just lying there and they can't sleep. And so much is coming to the fore because there's nothing else going on. There's no light, there's no
Right.
distractions, there's no stimulus whatsoever. And we're just free to maybe ponder. And I wish I was more disciplined. I'm very disciplined in so many areas, Julie, you know this, but I wish I
Mhm.
was more disciplined at having that unplugging more often and just having total boredom or total lack of input and just see what comes up. Because I reckon there's more in there for me.
I'm sure that there is, and that's the thing, right? I mean, we never have our best ideas in, like, the 5 minutes between meetings. The other thing too is what is directing you, right? Like, if technology is starting to direct you because it has this little red dot or, there's a little notification or what have you, then your attention is being hijacked all day long. Even if we have the sense that, like, we are directing it in some sense, it is also directing us, and I do think there's a lot of power in being able to wrangle that and step away. And it's hard. I'm the first to admit it's challenging.
Yeah, that whole building the gaps piece was something that I wrote down from the last
Mhm.
time that we spoke, and I've really done it. And for those that haven't gone back and listened, which you absolutely should, we were speaking about people have meeting back to back to back to back. How on earth do you ever have time to digest the ideas or thoughts or actions off the back of that? So for me, my calendar in my day job has
Yeah.
massive big blank spaces, and I know what's going to happen in those spaces. Things will become reactive and things will happen. But I give myself so much time to think, okay, so on that 9 a.m., we spoke about these 3 things. These 2 I can definitely action now, and this one I need to think about. So I need no emails, no calls, no nothing for the next half hour to understand what I'm going to do with that. And I think that's a game changer for so many quote unquote busy people to have time in
Mhm.
their calendar where there's nothing scheduled in. Now you know there's going to be something that goes in there because you're going to use that time. That's how we're wired. We're not lazy. And we
Yeah.
just go from there. But I really think that kind of building more blocks of gaps into the schedule is such a game changer.
It is, and it is one of the hardest things for me to get others to do because the thing is we start to equate busyness with productivity, and it isn't always that way. We can have the most, and I've asked people, I said, if you in this blank space of an hour or 2 hours, if you come up with a strategy around a product in your business, if you can come up with something that moves the needle, that space of 1 or 2 hours can be worth 100,000, 200,000 more. I mean, plus. And so building that in is not lack of productivity. We've linked productivity with constant busyness and doing, and not with how we think or thinking, or our ideas or some of the strategies that we can come up with. And I think that's a miss for us. I also think that, like, we start linking productivity with us at our base state. Like when you're early in your career, productivity is about just doing the work, getting the work done. But as you raise in your career, your highest and best use is not usually around the busy work. It's around the ideas, the networking, the connections, the other things that are take time but don't feel like real work. And so we discount them as being important, not as important, and they certainly are.
One of the terms that I had around it was you describe it as an accelerator, not a dead space or a dead
Mhm.
gap. And I was like, that's so true because it's allowing me to actually ponder and then do the thing that I need to do or push on that lever that I haven't had the time to do because I've been back to back in these Teams calls, which are checking in or are valuable to some extent, but they're not the real game changers.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that if you're able to parse that out, then it's you taking control. And to me, you directing is probably the most important thing that you can be doing throughout your workday is feeling like your entire workday. I'll have people who will say, my entire workday is reactive, and then I get to do work after my workday is over. And I think, oh, what a miss, right? I mean, you should be probably doing some work after your workday if you want to continue to push forward. But to have your entire workday be reactivity and there's no proactive moments, no proactive pushes, nothing that you're working on that's, for not just the immediate term, but for 3 months down the road, 6 months down the road, a year or 2 years, you should have those pushes in there so that you're always pushing the long goals and the short goals to some extent simultaneously as you move forward.
Absolutely. So yeah, people really need to be more aggressive with how they manage their diary to make sure there's gaps in there
Yeah.
to do the thing. One of the other lessons I learned from your Substack in the last year, Julie, was around the rules are not for you. And it was very much a call to arms for people to understand that all these different norms and things that we hold ourselves to around business, they aren't always correct. What are some of the biggest success or work myths that you've kind of seen evidence to the contrary of?
Yeah, I think that when I wrote that, one of the things that I noticed, because what I try to do is always pull insights from kind of very successful people, kind of the top 0.01 to like every day what people can use on the ground. And the thing that I saw here is that no one gets to a point of being ultra successful by following common paths. And common paths are what the majority of people follow. And I'll give you an example, even that is I think really easy for most to follow. You go into a job and there's always a chain that you can go up, right? You start off and you're an individual contributor, then you can be to manager, then maybe a director, then maybe, like you just continue to go up until eventually maybe you can be CMO or C-suite. But if C-suite is your goal, nothing wrong with that. But wait, if you go into one company and are going to go up the chain, that is going to take you 20 years. I mean, I don't know how long it takes, but you're waiting on somebody else to give you, like, to pull you into the next seat. And then you wait for someone else. But what we find, and what research bears out, is that if you stay in a job for a few years and you don't move to that next rung, finding a job outside where you apply to the next rung higher, you get the next level of compensation. And we all know that your compensation really is determined by your initial kind of round of negotiation. So you have the ability to take more control. So now instead of waiting for 5 years for that next level, you've just cut your time in half. And then maybe if you start a company, now you've put yourself in a certain seat, right? So, I mean, there's ways in which you can get to that C-suite, let's say, but you can cut the time in half, quarter to get to that seat and be completely prepared for it, but just by not waiting on others, not doing things by the common path. So that's a really easy one, I think, for people to understand. But you can also look at the rules not being for you by looking at the way in which people approach, kind of life. People all approach things in exactly the same way, and we can tell your listeners the formula as to how they do things. Right? You graduate high school, maybe you go to college, then maybe you get married and you buy your first home, and then you're in a stable job, and then you have children, and then like there's this path, right? But there are certainly many ways to do life and many ways to have what you want and do it in a way that is uniquely your own. And so I really hope that people are thinking about not like what is the next step that people tell me, but what do I really want? And then thinking, how can I get there? And how then challenging, how can I get there in half the time if you had to? And I think that people can find ways there and unique paths that are not linear. And that's a very important part to getting to very successful places.
And if we want success by its very nature, if you're comparing it to the median or the mean, is an outlier.
Correct.
So you must behave in some ways as an outlier. So as you say, if you were to get to the C-suite by early 30s rather than early 40s, you're a freak. How have you done that? That's incredible. That's mad.
Right.
But you had to take some sort of different route to get there, and it's unlikely that if you want to achieve that by a particular age or a particular milestone, you're going to not be able to have to do it like the person above you that did it in the way that they've always done it. And that's how it's traditionally done. So I think that's a helpful way of framing these things. What are some of the kind of unusual practices or beliefs that you see that people can kind of push away in terms of rules that are typically enforced in this space in the business world, Julie?
I think that a really good one that I think about is, if there's a way that something has always been done, that you kind of think about, how can I you have to first of all know where you're going. I think that's something that most people don't. They kind of outsource that, and they just it's going to sound terrible, but we get a little bit mentally lazy around that. We are tired, we have a lot going on in our lives, and so we think, well, I just want to get through the week. But when you're doing that, you're kind of outsourcing your own progress and your own kind of progress towards certain goals. So I think that we have to, if we want to really think about a rule, you think about, where do I want to go, have a lot of clarity around that. And when I say like a lot of clarity, be very specific. I want to, like, take some time away. And this is a great opportunity to use some of that empty space and actually think about, what do I want my life to look like in, let's say, 2 or 3 years, right? That's a very reasonable amount of time. And to say, what do I want it to look like in 3 years? Where am I right now? Where are the, like, how can I start thinking about paths to get there that are not the same? Like, can I get there through traditional paths? Probably not. How can I start thinking about and challenging myself to get there in a very creative way? Because what you want to do is, when you outsource your thinking, obviously you're not going to go anywhere that someone else doesn't put you. It's very much a outsourcing of your future. But when you decide where you want to be, then you force yourself, hopefully you force yourself to say, how can I get there in the time frame I'm giving myself? And so, like, then you are forced to be creative. Well, I can't do that here because I won't get that where I'm at right now. So let's see what the salary is at this other company. And then it's okay, well, that means I have to start networking with that person. Maybe I can connect with them on X, start having some conversations, slide into their DMs, start, like, there's a whole way in which you can navigate this world that is not traditional, and it goes outside of traditional bounds. That means you're not applying on LinkedIn or through their job postings. It means probably you're not even getting a job that's actively posted. It's creating relationships. So there are so many ways in which you can do that, but you have to know where you're going, what your timeline is, what your goals are, and challenge yourself not to go through a traditional path. Sometimes what I'll do with businesses that are doing well, I have one client and he's like, okay, I need my business to be bigger. And I say, well, how big? How big do we want to be? He's like, well, I would really like a billion in revenue. And I was like, okay, that's great. When would you like that by? Right? Like, what is kind of our time frame here? Oh, well, I think that we can do it in 5 years. I said, well, what if you had to do it in 3 years or 4 years? Oh, I don't know. Well, we could form partnerships. We could do X. We could do Y. We could do M&A, buy additional businesses, right? So then you start thinking really creatively, and you start to get to your goals faster. So that's what I challenge for everyone, is really, start looking at what the goal is, challenge yourself to get there faster, start not playing by traditional rules, and you'll start to be much more creative uh, than you think. As a really strange aside, but I think it's kind of fun to mention, when I started off very earlier. I worked in a supermax prison, and I did some work in this, like, a supermax prison. I don't know if it's the same everywhere, but it's a level 5 security prison. So people who are there 20 years to life, you're in it for the long haul. But what I saw that was so fascinating to me is that people became incredibly creative because they had those restraints. People would build things, create things. One guy he made a shank out of toothpaste and toilet paper, right? It was an actual weapon out of toothpaste and toilet paper. And it was a functioning weapon. It hardened, it had all these things. But, it's amazing that when we put these constraints on ourselves, we can be incredibly creative and come up with ideas that never occur to us outside of those constraints. So you have to put them on yourselves, because the world isn't going to do that for you.
Yeah, absolutely, and we just buck the trends, we buck the normality, and I
Hmm.
think, as you say, when you withdraw from what has always been done or what the expected path is, you give yourself the chance to be more creative on how to make and join those steps. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I've thought about when I think of your work, Julie, is like essential skills that people have that aren't necessarily taught. And one of the ones that you just named there was maybe going to a founder or an owner on X and networking with him there rather than LinkedIn, or rather than emailing his HR department. And I'd love to think about maybe some other skills that you think are really important that people maybe don't necessarily immediately think about or work on.
Well, when I think about essential skills, I think one of the things when you're looking at, careers, certainly, is that almost everyone is reachable now. which is a wild world, right? I mean, aside from maybe some very, very high level folks, as you know, almost everyone is reachable if you have the moxie and you're able to kind of put the effort in. And I think that's fantastic. I think some of the essential skills, though, that people really lack are thinking about like critical thinking for yourself, evaluating information differently. I think that we're very much in, at least in the US and probably everywhere, we have a very herd mentality about everything, right? And people kind of almost form teams around their beliefs. But I always find the most interesting people to have beliefs that cut across various lines and have that aren't really in certain boxes. And to me, that's all about, individual thinking and perspective taking. Some of the most interesting people I know are like that. There's a guy that I know who is he's a bodybuilder and he competes and he's huge, just like a massive man. And we connected because he loves Victorian wallpaper, right? Like, that's cool. He thinks for himself. He's interested in things that he likes. And I think that those are people, whether it's about something silly like that, or it's about your kind of beliefs about other things, that you do your homework, you do your research, you understand and evaluate information critically. So I would say another skill is evaluating information critically, digging in and being your own person as much as you are going to feel the capacity to conform. One of the things about the guy who likes the wallpaper, for example, is that being unique and being just unapologetically yourself is what makes you stand out. Like everyone feels pressure to have a certain definition of like masculinity or femininity or whatever that is. But like, who forgets the person who has this like really quirky, unique thing about themselves? Like they're fun to date, they're fun to know, they're great friends to have. And they allow us to actually have a part of ourselves that is unique as well. So I always hope that, unapologetically yourself also allows you in your career to kind of be able to dig into who you are, what your goals are, and not like apologize for those things. You can be
And
unapologetically ambitious. You can have it with your hobbies. And I hope that people can feel that they can be themselves. It's what makes you an attractive person.
of course, and nobody is better at being you than you. And if you lean into
Right.
all those idiosyncrasies and unique characteristics, so for example, you may be the big jack bodybuilder who just has this really fascination with like how wallpaper is, and all the guys at the gym don't get it, but it doesn't matter because he's found somebody else that he can talk to, like you, he can talk to about it, and that's cool. And it
Sure.
wouldn't immediately be an obvious friendship, but guess what? You guys get on like a house on fire on this particular topic. Great, let's
Yeah.
roll with it. And I think that whole not allowing yourself to, and I think the term that came to mind for me was like groupthink, is like if you have
Yeah.
like one opinion. So if I'm, and again in the US it's maybe easier to explain, so if somebody's pro-life, they're normally
Mhm.
pro-gun, or if they're whatever topic we think about, that you can sometimes extrapolate out and be like, I know all your views on these things. And I think that's a really dangerous position
Yeah.
to end up in, and that means you've kind of like downloaded somebody's thought process or somebody's political beliefs like to every single extent, and you're thinking, goodness me, like if you really thought about some of these things, you might have a contrarian take, and it might be okay for you to not agree with the tribe on these two or three things, but maybe you're fully on board with everything else they say, and that should be okay. And that's probably one of the reasons we're in such a mess politically, Julie.
Yes, I mean, I think that people think ideas are like sports teams, like you have to buy it all. And I remember that there was a really funny interviewer, I forget who it was, who would go out and interview folks and just say, this is the belief on abortion of X, and everyone would agree with it who supported X. But it really wasn't their position at all. And, like, so they would kind of go around and interview people about certain political positions that weren't even the position of the candidate and actually was the position of the opponent. And everyone was like enthusiastically agreeing and explaining why and all of these things. So we see that like kind of critical thinking is incredibly important. But it's important for a range of things. I also think, for what it's worth, perspective taking is an incredibly important skill, both for being able to solve problems, to be able to communicate effectively, to understand other people's positions you don't agree with, and really being thoughtful around that. Because there are, not everyone who thinks differently than you is a bad actor. Oftentimes they have reasons for thinking that, and understanding those reasons helps you both solidify your own thoughts, but also understand where other people are coming from to be a better person in the world and a global citizen.
Yeah, and I'm far from woke, and many people that listen to my content will think I'm potentially anti woke in some senses in
Mm.
some of the policies that come out there. but the term lived experience has almost been captured by that particular side of ideology. But I think it's really important that you take into account somebody's quote unquote lived experience to understand why their views are the way they are. So, for example, somebody who's grown up in extreme poverty may be higher in favor of higher taxes to redistribute the wealth because they know the difference that that might make. Whereas somebody who's grown up in a very wealthy household and thinks, oh, taxation is theft. And don't get me wrong, there's times that that can feel that way. But
Sure.
they're less likely to understand why redistribution is so important because they maybe haven't seen with their eyes wide open. Equally, somebody who's grown up and has come out as homosexual will maybe be more focused on homosexual rights and understanding like how far we've come in that space and what is left to do. And it's all about understanding what somebody has been through to maybe understand why their views or their opinions are the way they are. And I think that's where somebody like yourself and myself, who are a bit more open-minded, I would say, can maybe consider, oh, well, you've grown up in that environment for 20 years. Of course you think that way, or of course you're more inclined to think that way. And also all the sources that we consume. If I marinate all day long in a particular source, I'm
Yeah.
probably going to think like that person thinks, or at least feel that their ideas are more robust than somebody who I've never heard their perspective from.
Yeah, and I think that, to your point, being open-minded does not mean that you, don't have very solid beliefs. It means that you're open to thinking and considering, and I think that if you have a podcast, you're probably a naturally curious person. And so you are interested in how people think. And it's almost like, I always say that when people really struggle with this, approach it like a scientist. You have a hypothesis, right? That's probably your beliefs, but you really want to be open-minded in examining it because the end result may end up disproving that hypothesis if you're really truly open. And so being able to take in information, being curious about information, and being able to kind of think about it, it puts you in a better position overall. And even towards your career, when you start to think about that, if you block out, like sometimes I hear people and they'll say, oh, all rich people are X, or, like I hate X. And if you hate money, if you hate rich people, the chances of you moving yourself in that direction to ever become wealthy, not going to happen because you're never going to work toward something that you hate. You just won't do it by nature. And so it's going to be very challenging. And then you're stuck in a place where you don't have resources. And then you continue to be resentful. And so it really is important to understand how your beliefs really either are drawing you toward that thing or they're kind of keeping you and blocking you from that thing. And you don't want to be somebody who, like, I hear that sometimes toward people who are dating, all men are X or all women are Y. And if you believe that, are you going to form great relationships, be totally open and, be a great dating partner? Probably not. So it's
Self-fulfilling
important.
prophecy at that point. Your energy is going to be
Absolutely.
the same. Like, all girls can't be trusted or all guys cheat. And you're like, oh, well, if you come with that energy, you're probably going to end up and around those kind of people. And yeah,
Absolutely.
I believe that.
Absolutely. Go
And
ahead, sorry.
in the time we've got left, Dr.
Yeah.
G, I want to ask you about three things that we hold on to mentally, and some of those are probably
Mhm.
linked to what we've just spoken about there. And those three things are: one, accelerators; two, stabilizers; and three, anchors. I guess what we just spoke about there is probably an anchor that somebody might hold on to a belief like that. Can you just talk us through what those are?
Sure. Accelerators are things mentally that you hold on that really drive you forward, right? So these can be anything from, personally, like things, the capacity that you have, the belief maybe you have that you can figure this out. Like, I've figured out any problem I've come across, I can figure out this one, right? So there are mental states that we hold on to and mindsets that we hold on to, and even people we hold on to in our lives that are accelerators. They're people who could tell us we could do anything. But then we have stabilizers, and I think stabilizers are incredibly important. Stabilizers really form the foundation of our homeostasis. Maybe these are your routines, the identity you have around who you are, the things that we do consistently, our work ethic, the consistency in which we approach our days, the mindset around who we are and our identity, and things that will form this kind of stable base for us. And then the anchors that we hold on to, hopefully that we don't hold on to, are things that kind of like our memories of past failures, our challenges around our beliefs that are dysfunctional, that keep us pushed away from things that we want. All of those things are really anchors in our lives. And it takes a lot of, I've used this term earlier, but it takes a lot of moxie and a lot of challenge to really be honest with ourselves and say, you know what? If you see a repeated problem in your life or something continues to go wrong, if you don't take a moment and say, what role did I play in that? then you're missing out on the opportunity to really improve your life. And we don't like to look at ourselves as the problem, but if something keeps happening over and over again, you are the common theme. You are part of the problem. So you have to be able to evaluate that and say, if you make that shift, the good news is if you're part of that problem, you can change the problem. And so you can really make things work for yourself. And I encourage people, to be very direct and very hard on themselves in that way. We tend to be very hard on everyone else and very tender with ourselves. We can't be the problem. We protect our ego with a fortress. And if you have high ego and you can't look at your own flaws or faults and, can't acknowledge where you're wrong, the most confident people can ingest and say, you can always tell a very confident versus arrogant person, because a confident person can hear challenges and correct. They can self-correct, because it doesn't slight their ego. They know who they are. But somebody who is arrogant and has high ego is honestly, they end up being quite fragile because they're reactive. They can't ingest anything that's criticism. And so then they end up repeating patterns. It's very off-putting, and they protect it with some, bravado and other
Some
things.
story.
So
You become the hero in your own story. And do you know,
absolutely.
do you know, from an accelerator perspective, and this is a little bit ego led, I will sometimes
Mhm.
be like, I'll be the guy that will close that deal. I'll be the guy that will get the door open to that
Yeah,
client. I'll be the guy that can prep for the podcast and hang with Dr. G and have a great conversation and be well researched. Sometimes you have to have, like, not egotistical, but really confidence inducing
confidence.
accelerators that stick with you. And you can obviously nudge over to the wrong side of that. But having those accelerators and having that self talk around who I am and what I hold myself up as has been really important for me, having a strong identity with who I am and then acting in accordance with that identity so that they match. Because I would feel terrible if I said, oh, I'm a 7-figure sales guy, if I didn't make some effing sales, because I would like it would be terrible, wouldn't it? I would be a really
Right.
really weak person. So I love the whole concept of accelerators. I want to keep feeding those and pushing them forward, and any
Agreed.
anchors or self-limiting things that I've got, as much as possible, cutting them away, getting rid of them, and pushing them away, and not allowing them to, as the anchor phrasing and terminology would say, hold you back or weigh you down.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanna just nudge you back on is that I don't think that using that as an accelerator is ego at all. I think it's
Okay.
actually it's self-knowledge. You know what you can do. You know what you're capable of. And so to me, that's not ego or bravado. That is self-knowledge that you work to fulfill. And to me, that's a really powerful place to come from, is that, you carry the knowledge that you can hit those 7 figures. You carry the knowledge that it's possible, and then you make good on that. And when you do that, you kind of reinforce that and you really make yourself proud. And it's why, from the research, we know that grit is correlated with happiness. When we can do the hard thing and we can like push through it, we make ourselves proud. And no one ever gets excited because they completed a walk, to the mailbox, unless you have some physical challenge. But if you
Yeah.
go through a physical challenge that is hard and grueling and you come out the other side and you complete it, you are like elated. And it's the same thing with business, right? Like we make ourselves proud through what we demonstrate we have the capacity to do.
So true, Dr. Julie. And I hope people come away from this aiming to make themselves proud of what they do and aiming to push themselves forward. I've had such a great time talking to you again. I'm sure the listeners have loved having you back on the show as well. If you want them to continue the conversation with you, where should they head towards?
They should head toward X. They can reach me at Dr. Gurner, or they can find me at Ultra Successful on Substack. It's a newsletter there that you'd referred to, Colin. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Julie. Those will both be linked in the show notes, and I'll be back to speak to the listeners again very, very soon.